The silent passenger. I've been driving cabs in Dhaka for almost a decade, but I never had a night like that one. It started like any other shift. Hot air, thick with exhaust, neon signs flickering along the cracked sidewalks, the endless honking of impatient drivers. I had just dropped off a passenger near the university and was cruising through an older part of the city when I saw him. A man stood alone beneath a dim streetlight, his face half in shadow. He wasn't waving me down, but something about the way he lingered, hands buried in his pockets, gaze locked on my car, made me slow. Against my better judgment, I eased to a stop. He stepped forward, expression unreadable. "Are you still taking fares?" His voice was low, flat. Something about it made my skin prickle, but I nodded. "Where to?" "Just drive," he said, climbing into the back seat. I hesitated. No address, no destination. People like that were trouble. But something in his tone made it feel less like a request and more like a statement of fact. I pulled back onto the road. For the first few minutes, he said nothing. I kept glancing at him in the rear view, but he sat stiffly, staring out the window. His face was gaunt, eyes sunken in a way that suggested exhaustion or something worse. He wore an old gray coat frayed at the cuffs. "Been working long?" he asked suddenly. "Since noon," I said. "Another hour, maybe." "Must be tiring," I shrugged. "You get used to it." A red light stopped us near a market, the vendors packing up for the night. The air smelled of old fish and burning charcoal. When I glanced at the mirror again, I saw something that made my stomach tighten. He was staring at me. Not at the window. Not on the road. At me. His face was unreadable, his dark eyes locked onto mine. I forced myself to look away. The light turned green. I hit the gas. The roads grew quieter as we left the market behind, buildings thinning out. A mist had begun, creeping along the ground, swallowing the edges of the street. He hadn't given me a destination, but somehow I knew I was heading exactly where he wanted. Then I noticed it, a flicker in the side mirror. At first I thought it was just a trick of the light, a glint maybe from a passing rickshaw. But as I kept driving, the flicker stayed, like something was trailing the car. I checked my mirrors again. Nothing. The hairs on my arms stood up. "You ever get the feeling," he murmured from the back seat, "that you're not alone?" I gripped the wheel. "What do you mean?" He didn't answer. Something about the silence felt heavy, suffocating. I flicked on the radio, hoping for a distraction, but all I got was static. Another glance at the mirror, another flicker. This time it wasn't a trick of the light. There was something moving just beyond my taillights. A shape, just barely visible in the fog. I swallowed hard. "Sir, where exactly?" The car jerked. I nearly lost control, tires skidding on the uneven pavement. My breath hitched as I steadied the wheel. Had I hit something? Stopped the car. The man's voice was calm. Too calm. I hesitated. Every instinct screamed and kept driving. But my hands moved before my brain could catch up. I eased to a stop by the side of the road. The silence stretched. He leaned forward slightly, just enough that I could feel his breath against my neck. "Don't look back." My heart pounded. "What?" "Don't look back." I couldn't move. A deep, rasping sound filled the car, something between a breath and a growl. It came from behind me, not from the man, something else. I clenched my hands around the wheel. My pulse hammered so hard I could hear it in my ears. The air inside the cab felt wrong, like it had been sucked dry. The man in the back seat let out a slow exhale. "Drive." I obeyed without question. As I pressed the gas, I saw movement in my peripheral vision, a shadow shifting along the roadside, long-limbed, unnatural. I kept my eyes locked on the road ahead, refusing to look directly at it. "Keep going," the man muttered. I drove, block after block, the city creeping back into view. I could still feel it, whatever it was, lingering just beyond my vision, but it wasn't followed anymore. By the time I reached a busier street, my shirt was damp with sweat. My hands ached from gripping the wheel. The man exhaled, as if relieved. "Pull over here," he said. I did. He reached into his coat, pulled out a few crumpled bills and set them on the seat beside me. I was too shaken to check how much. Before he climbed out, he met my gaze in the mirror. "You were lucky tonight," I swallowed. What was that thing? For the first time, his expression changed. A flicker of something. Pity. "Next time," he said, stepping out into the night, "don't stop." Then he was gone. I sat there, gripping the wheel, staring at the empty sidewalk where he'd vanished. After a long moment, I put the car in gear and drove. I never saw him again. But sometimes when I'm working the late shift, I check the mirrors, and every now and then, I still see the flicker. It was a late, rainy night in Los Angeles, and I was driving home alone from my friend Jake's house. He lived on the far side of the city, about an hour away, in a quiet neighborhood near the hills. It was past 1 a.m., and I was exhausted. I had thought about staying over, but I had work in the morning, and missing it wasn't an option. The streets were slick with rain, and the city felt eerily empty. I had the radio playing softly, just to keep myself awake. The steady rhythm of the rain against my windshield made it even harder to stay focused. Then, out of nowhere, my headlights caught something right in the middle of the road. I hit the brakes hard. There, sitting perfectly upright in the street, was a suitcase. A big, dark-colored one, like something you'd take on a long trip. It looked completely out of place. I sat there for a moment, staring at it, confused. Who would leave a suitcase in the middle of the road on a night like this? I wasn't about to get out and move it, so I carefully steered into the next lane and went around it. Maybe it fell off someone's car. That made sense, right? Trying not to think too much about it, I kept driving. A few minutes later, the rain was still coming down, and the streets were just as empty. But then, up ahead, I saw something else, this time a truck. It was parked right in the middle of my lane, no lights, no blinkers, nothing. If I hadn't had my headlights on, I might have slammed right into it. I stopped behind it and waited, expecting someone to get out. Nothing. I honked my horn a few times. Still nothing. The truck just sat there, lifeless. Something about it didn't feel right. I slowly pulled into the other lane to go around it, and as I passed, I noticed deep scratches and dents along the side. Maybe it had been in an accident? But the strangest part, there was nobody inside. I looked through the windows, but it was too dark to see much. No driver, no passenger, nothing. That uneasy feeling in my gut got stronger. This wasn't normal. There was nothing around but empty streets and the occasional street light reflecting off the wet pavement. Where was the driver? Trying to shake off the nerves, I kept driving, telling myself it was just a broken-down truck. But then, not even a minute later, I saw something that made my stomach drop. A man. He was standing right in the middle of the road, waving his arms at me to stop. He looked like he was in his 40s, soaking wet from the rain with messy hair and scrapes on his arms. His clothes were wrinkled and dirty, like he'd been out here for a while. As soon as I stopped, he gave me this wide, unsettling smile and walked up to my window. "Hey, did you see a truck back there?" he asked. I hesitated before answering. "Yeah. Think you could give me a lift back to it?" That feeling of dread came rushing back. Something was wrong. I didn't answer right away, so I asked, "Why is it parked like that? What are you doing out here?" He paused just for a second, like he wasn't sure what to say. Then he shrugged and mumbled something about running out of gas and walking to a gas station. But that didn't make sense. If he was out looking for gas, why would he ask me to take him back to the truck instead of the station? I was trying to come up with an excuse, anything to get out of this, when I happened to glance behind him. That's when I saw it. Deep in the bushes off the side of the road, half hidden in the dark, was the back end of a car. It was barely visible, but I could see the red glow of a tail light reflecting off the wet leaves. I didn't know what was going on, but I knew it wasn't good. I reached for my window switch and rolled it up. The man's expression changed instantly. His smile vanished. His eyes widened. Then he started pounding on the glass, shouting at me. I didn't wait. I hit the gas and sped away. My hands were shaking as I reached for my phone and called the police. When they got there, the truck was gone. But the car hidden in the bushes, that was still there. And what they found inside was worse than I could have ever imagined. It turned out the car belonged to someone else, someone who had picked up a hitchhiker, and that hitchhiker had been the last person they ever saw. The police suspected the whole thing, the suitcase, the truck, was part of a setup to get drivers to stop. They weren't sure, but the pattern was clear. And the man I saw? He had no reason to be out there. His truck hadn't run out of gas. It was all a trap. That night I had been seconds away from making the same mistake. If I had let him in my car, I might not have made it home either. The man was never identified. The passenger who never left. The night was unusually cold for September, and the air smelled of damp asphalt and burning leaves. I had been driving for nearly 4 hours, my shift dragging longer than usual. The city had melted into distant highway lights, leaving me alone with the hum of my tires and the static-filled radio. It was past midnight when I saw him. A man stood at the edge of the road, just beyond the reach of the streetlight. He wasn't waving for a ride. He just stood there, hands in his pockets, head slightly tilted, watching my cab approach. I should have kept driving, but I didn't. I slowed, rolling down the window just enough to be heard. "Need a ride?" The man stepped forward, his face emerging from the shadows. His features were sharp, sunken, his eyes reflecting the glow of my headlights. He was tall, wrapped in a long gray coat that looked damp from the evening mist. "Yeah," he said in a low voice. "If you're heading north." I hesitated. Something about him unsettled me. But a fare was a fare, and I was already running behind on my night's earnings. "Hop in." The back door creaked as he got in. The scent of damp fabric and something faintly metallic filled the cab. I adjusted the rearview mirror, catching his expression. His face was unreadable. "Where to?" I asked, pulling onto the road. "Just drive." A sharp chill ran down my spine. The way he said it, flat, emotionless, made my fingers tighten around the wheel. The road stretched empty ahead, swallowed by darkness beyond my headlights. The silence in the cab felt heavy, pressing against my chest. I flicked on the radio, hoping for some background noise. Static. Every station was nothing but static. I frowned and turned it off. "You live around here?" The man didn't answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet. "I used to." I nodded, keeping my eyes on the road. The mist had thickened, curling in slow tendrils across the asphalt. It was the kind of fog that made everything feel off, like the world outside wasn't quite real. Then I saw it, a flicker in the side mirror, just for a second, like something moving behind us. But when I glanced back, there was nothing, just an empty road. "Everything all right?" The man's voice was closer than before. I stiffened. He was still in the back seat, still sitting in the same spot. But his reflection in the mirror was off. The angle was wrong, as if he wasn't sitting where he should be. I swallowed. "Yeah, just thought I saw something." Silence. Then he spoke again, voice lower this time. "You ever get the feeling you're not alone?" I gripped the wheel tighter. "What do you mean?" "Like something is riding with you, watching." I forced out a chuckle. "Are you trying to scare me?" The man didn't laugh. The road stretched on, the mist swallowing the trees on either side. I kept glancing at the mirror, at the space behind me, at the way his reflection didn't quite match his position in the seat. Then, just as I was about to say something, the car jerked violently. I gasped, fighting for control as the tires skidded on the damp road. My headlights flickered, and for a split second I saw something in the trees, a shape, tall and wrong, with too many limbs. Then it was gone. I slammed the brakes, breathing hard. My hands were shaking. "What the hell was that?" This man leaned forward slightly. His breath was ice cold against my neck. "Drive." I obeyed. The fog thickened, swallowing the world outside. My headlights barely cut through it now. The car felt too small, like something unseen was pressing against its edges. "You picked me up once before," the man murmured. I frowned. "No, I don't think so." "You did." His voice was calm, certain. "Years ago. Same road, same night." I felt my heartbeat stutter. That was impossible. I'd only been driving this route for a few months. The road twisted ahead, the trees crowding closer. Shadows moved in the mist, shapes shifting just beyond my vision. "You let me in," he said, "but you never let me out." A horrible, cold weight settled in my stomach. I risked a glance at the mirror. He wasn't there. Not in the mirror, not in the seat, but I felt him. The weight of his presence, the cold air thick with something unspeakable. My breath hitched, my pulse pounded. The mist outside wasn't just fog anymore. It was faces. Twisted, hollow-eyed faces pressing against the glass, mouths open in silent screams. And then I heard it. The slow, creaking shift of leather behind me. I didn't look. I couldn't look. My hands clenched the wheel, my knuckles white. I stepped on the gas, pushing the car faster, desperate to outrun something I couldn't see. The radio crackled. A voice, low, almost familiar, whispered through the static. "You never stopped." But I never left. A sound, wet, rustling, filled the cab. The cold breath of something inches from my ear. I slammed my foot against the pedal. The engine roared. The speedometer needle jumped. The mist thinned, then broke as the city lights finally appeared in the distance. And then, silence. I risked a glance at the mirror. The back seat was empty. No damp coat. No hollow-eyed passenger. but the seat was still warm. I pulled into a gas station, my hands shaking as I fumbled to kill the engine. My breath came in shallow, gasps. The attendant gave me a strange look as I stepped out. "You all right, man?" I nodded, forcing my breathing to slow. "Yeah, just a long night."